Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lamps of history and walk into the soft hazy glow of one of the most famous cities to ever exist, Babylon. It's the place your high school textbook probably mentioned 3 times before moving on, but it's also the kind of city whose name echoes like a bedtime chant, Babylon. A little dramatic, a little mysterious, and spoiler alert, a lot more disappointing when you meet the actual kings who ran the place. So, tuck in. Let your blankets pile up just enough to feel like you're being slightly buried alive, but in a cozy way, and let's drift back about 4,000 years. Somewhere between the invention of beer and the eternal mystery of why ancient people thought conical beards were a fashion statement. Now, Babylon didn't start as some glittering metropolis. Honestly, it began like most big empires, basically as a glorified mud village. We're talking about a patch of Mesopotamia nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that fertile little wedge of land where human civilization apparently decided to sprout like a badly planned garden. By around 1894 BCE, Babylon was still a minor city-state, a sort of scrappy underdog compared to its louder neighbours. Think of it as the kid in school who wasn't good at sports but had an older cousin who worked out, so eventually people left him alone. And then came Hammurabi. You know, the eye for an eye guy. Hammurabi rolled onto the scene around 1792 BCE, inheriting the throne from his dad, who honestly didn't make much of a splash. His father was basically the warm-up act that nobody clapped for, but Hammurabi, he knew how to play the long game. At first, Hammurabi was all about smiling, making alliances, and being the polite king next door. He waited patiently, sipping metaphorical tea, while other kingdoms were busy punching each other in the face. And then, when everyone else was too exhausted, he swooped in. Over the decades, Hammurabi expanded Babylon from a modest city-state into a proper empire. He conquered Sumer and Akkad, bullied his neighbours, and set himself up as basically the Mesopotamian hall monitor. But he wasn't just swinging swords, he was also laying down rules. Literally. You've probably heard of the Code of Hammurabi. It's famous for those very casual lines like, "If a builder builds a house and it collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death," which is kind of a rough performance review. The whole thing was carved into a massive stone stele, over 280 laws covering everything from theft to divorce to how much beer rations workers should get. Spoiler, not nearly enough. And sure, Hammurabi gets remembered as this lawgiver king, but let's be honest, it wasn't some enlightened constitution, it was more like, hey, let's write down ways to keep peasants terrified and make sure elites stay comfy. So, pretty much business as usual in history. Anyway, under Hammurabi, Babylon was the place. The city of Mesopotamia. Temples went up, canals were dug, crops flourished. Hammurabi even got himself deified after death, which, you know, is what every ancient king wanted. Because nothing says humble leadership like demanding people worship your ghost. But here's the thing with golden ages, they never last. After Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE, his heirs, well, let's just say they weren't exactly up to the task. They tried to hold things together, but the empire cracked apart faster than a clay tablet in the sun. Babylon went from powerhouse to meh in about a century. It's almost poetic. Let's drift forward a few hundred years. By the 1200s BCE, Babylon had become one of those cities that kept getting conquered like it was stuck in a bad relationship cycle. First the Kassites moved in, then the Elamites looted the place, then the Assyrians popped by for a not-so-friendly takeover. It was basically the Airbnb of ancient empires. But even as Babylon got tossed around, the city itself held this strange magnetism. People kept coming back, rebuilding and pretending it was still glamorous. Kind of like a Las Vegas casino that refuses to shut down even when half the lights are flickering. And honestly, that's the Babylon story in a nutshell. Rise, fall, repeat. Now, if we drift over to the late 8th and 7th centuries BCE, things get messy again. The Assyrians were on top. Big, scary empire, iron weapons, professional army, terrifying artwork of kings stabbing lions for fun. And Babylon, poor Babylon, kept getting smacked around in the process. But here's the twist. The Babylonians didn't take humiliation well. They had a bit of a rebellious streak, and by the 7th century, they decided enough was enough. Enter Nabopolassar. Great name, right? Sounds like a failed soft drink brand, but Nabopolassar was the guy who led Babylon back to glory. In 626 BCE, he kicked off a revolt against the Assyrians, and guess what? He actually won. Which is impressive because the Assyrians usually treated rebels like bug splat. With some help from the Medes, basically another up-and-coming power, Nabopolassar smashed the Assyrian Empire into pieces. By 612 BCE, Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, was a smoking ruin. The Babylonians were back on the throne, baby. This kicked off what historians call the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and at the top of it all was Nabopolassar's son. You've probably heard his name whispered in dusty classrooms, Nebuchadnezzar II. Yeah, the guy who shows up in the Bible, tossing people into fiery furnaces and building things so fancy that later historians weren't sure if they were real. Nebuchadnezzar ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, and under him, Babylon became absurdly rich and shiny. We're talking massive temples, thick city walls, and allegedly the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which might have existed, or might have just been ancient propaganda. We'll never really know, because ancient people had the irritating habit of bragging without receipts. Nebuchadnezzar was a builder at heart. He poured resources into making Babylon the architectural flex of the ancient world. The city walls were so thick that later writers claimed chariots could race on top of them, which sure sounds cool, but also feels like the kind of exaggeration you'd hear from a drunk uncle. He built the Ishtar Gate covered in glazed blue bricks with lions, dragons and bulls. Imagine walking through that as a peasant, dragging your sandals through dust and suddenly seeing this enormous glittering gate staring you down. Instant intimidation. And then there's the Hanging Gardens, supposedly a lush terraced mountain of greenery built for his wife, who missed the hills of her homeland. Romantic, right? Except the only problem is, no Babylonian text ever mentions them. Not once. All our references come from later Greek writers, which makes it a bit suspicious. Like, did Nebuchadnezzar actually build a wonder of the world? Or did Greek tourists just see a rooftop garden and lose their minds? We'll never know. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't all flowers and pretty gates. He was also ruthless. He crushed revolts, expanded his empire across the Levant, and famously sacked Jerusalem in 586 BCE. This is where the whole exile of the Jewish people comes in, which the Bible understandably wasn't thrilled about. But to Nebuchadnezzar, it was just Tuesday. Empire's gonna empire. Still, by the time he died in 562 BCE, Babylon was at its absolute peak. Wealthy, glorious, the city everyone whispered about. And then, predictably, the decline began again. After Nebuchadnezzar, his successors basically treated the empire like a family heirloom they didn't want but had to babysit. Weak kings, messy politics, and the kind of palace intrigue that usually ends in poison. One standout disaster was Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon. He reigned from 556 to 539 BCE, and he had, let's just call them quirky priorities. Instead of hanging out in Babylon and ruling, he wandered off to Arabia for 10 years to worship the moon god Sin, which, you know, is a bold move when your empire needs attention. People in Babylon weren't thrilled, and that discontent set the stage for the next big guest star, Cyrus the Great of Persia. Cyrus marched in around 539 BCE, and honestly, the Babylonians barely resisted. The city fell with hardly a fight. Cyrus even styled himself as a liberator, not a conqueror. He let people worship their own gods, which made him way more popular than poor moon god Nabonidus. And just like that, Babylon stopped being the centre of the world. It became another jewel in Persia's crown, still important, still impressive, but no longer calling the shots. So that's the gentle arc of Babylon's first big rise and fall moment. From Hammurabi's laws to Nebuchadnezzar's shiny gates, to Nabonidus wandering off like a spiritual influencer, and finally, Cyrus casually walking in like he owned the place. But don't worry, we're not done yet. Babylon's story lingers for centuries. It gets conquered again and again. Alexander the Great shows up. The city decays brick by brick until eventually it's just ruins for 19th century archaeologists to bicker over. But that, my sleepy friends, is for the next part. For now, let's pause here, still surrounded by Babylon's flickering oil lamps and the echo of its vanished walls. So, when we left off, Babylon had just flopped into the arms of Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE. And the thing is, Cyrus didn't exactly storm the place with fireworks and bloodshed. According to the Cyrus cylinder, a cute little clay propaganda piece, he strolled in peacefully like, "Hey guys, don't worry, I'm just here to fix things." And of course, Cyrus portrayed himself as the hero. He claimed that the Babylonian god Marduk had basically fired Nabonidus and handed Cyrus the keys to the city, which, let's be honest, was an ancient way of saying, "Even your gods wanted me to be in charge." Convenient. The Babylonians didn't argue. After Nabonidus had gone off on his moon-worshipping vacation spree, pretty much anyone looked like an upgrade. Now under the Persians, Babylon still mattered. It wasn't abandoned overnight. In fact, it became one of the empire's main administrative centres, which sounds fancy, but really meant, congratulations, you're now a glorified tax office. The Persians, being efficient empire builders, used Babylon as one of their capitals. They collected tribute there, stored grain, and occasionally lived it up in the city. But Babylon wasn't in charge anymore. It was more like the decorative vase in a new house, still pretty, but mostly just for show. And to be fair, Babylon was still stunning at this point. The Ishtar Gate still gleamed. The massive walls still stood. Temples were still buzzing with rituals. Travellers would walk in and think, wow, this is the centre of the universe. Even if politically the city was already kind of sidelined, Cyrus's successors kept the show going. Cambyses II, his son, passed through Babylon on his way to Egypt. Darius I, the great organiser, also used Babylon as an administrative hub. And here's a fun fact. Many of the famous cuneiform tablets we have about taxes, rents and beer rations come from this period, which means most of what we know about Babylonian life under Persia boils down to receipts, humanity's true legacy, paperwork. But of course, every golden lamp eventually flickers. Babylon, while still impressive, started to lose a little shine. Temples fell into disrepair. Persian kings got more interested in Persepolis, their glittering new capital. Babylon was slowly turning into the second favourite child. And then, enter Alexander the Great. Let's float over to 331 BCE. Alexander, fresh off smashing the Persians at the Battle of Gaugamela, marched into Babylon. And here's the twist. Just like with Cyrus, the city didn't resist. The Babylonians opened the gates and practically threw him a welcome party. By this point, they'd developed a very practical survival strategy. Just roll out the red carpet for whoever's in charge this week. Alexander loved Babylon. Supposedly, he planned to make it the capital of his new empire. Imagine that. Babylon reborn as the centre of the Greek Macedonian world. He spent time there, ordered repairs to temples, and even promised to restore the ziggurat of Marduk, which by then was basically a very tall pile of sad bricks. But as we know, Alexander had one glaring weakness: not living very long. In 323 BCE, at the ripe old age of 32, Alexander died in Babylon, probably of malaria, or typhoid, or maybe alcohol poisoning. Scholars love to argue about it, but whatever the cause, it happened in the city's palace. Picture it. The greatest conqueror of the ancient world, gasping his last breath under Babylonian ceilings. A dramatic final act, but also incredibly inconvenient for the city. Because once Alexander died, his generals, known as the Diadochi, descended into a decades-long brawl over his empire. Babylon, being valuable real estate, got dragged right into the chaos. For a while, Babylon ended up under Seleucus I, one of Alexander's top commanders. He founded the Seleucid Empire, which stretched from Greece to Persia, and he decided, in a very on-brand Greek move, that Babylon was too old-fashioned. So around 305 BCE, Seleucus built a brand new city, Seleucia on the Tigris. Very original name. He even moved about half of Babylon's population there. Imagine being a Babylonian and suddenly told, "Pack up, we're moving to this shiny new place because our king wants something more modern." It was basically ancient gentrification. Seleucia quickly became the new hotspot, and Babylon, well, Babylon started to look like that cool nightclub everyone used to go to but now only sad uncles talk about. Still, Babylon limped along. For centuries people continued living among its temples and walls, but the glory days were gone. The Seleucids favoured their new cities, the Parthians later ruled the region and let Babylon decay further. Slowly, the once great metropolis was eaten alive by time, dust and neglect. There are scattered mentions of Babylon in later classical sources, and they're usually depressing. Greek and Roman writers would pass through and be like, "Oh, this place. Yeah, it used to be amazing." Now it's basically rubble, which is harsh, but also not inaccurate. By the 1st century CE, Babylon was little more than a ghost of itself. Villagers squatted in the ruins, temples were crumbling, the Euphrates kept shifting course, leaving parts of the city abandoned. But here's the funny part. Even as Babylon physically crumbled, its reputation grew bigger and bigger in people's imaginations. To the Greeks and Romans, it became this legendary symbol of excess and decadence. To biblical writers, it was the ultimate villain city, prideful, sinful, doomed. Later on, Christians would turn Babylon into shorthand for basically anything evil. By the Middle Ages, people probably pictured it as a glittering den of sin that deserved to be destroyed. So ironically, the real Babylon was falling apart quietly in Mesopotamia, while the idea of Babylon was ballooning into myth, which if you think about it is the perfect afterlife for a city. And here's where the ruins come in. Fast forward to the 19th century. European archaeologists started poking around Mesopotamia, and what did they find? Piles of bricks, thousands of them, stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name, broken temples, crumbling walls, all the leftovers of what had once been the Gate of the Gods. German excavators in the late 1800s actually dug up the Ishtar Gate piece by piece and shipped it back to Berlin. You can still see it reconstructed today in the Pergamon Museum, which is wonderful if you're in Berlin, and slightly insulting if you're Mesopotamian. Babylon itself, meanwhile, sits in modern Iraq. Tourists can walk among the ruins, though they'll mostly find mud brick walls, a few foundations and a lot of heat. And that's really the end of the arc. Babylon, once the heart of Mesopotamia, slowly dissolved into dust. But in myth and memory it never really died. It still echoes in phrases like the Whore of Babylon or Babylonian captivity, or, if you're into reggae, Babylon as the oppressive system. Pretty impressive for a city that hasn't been alive for 2 millennia. So, as we let this story drift away into the dark, picture Babylon as it was at its peak. Gates of blue brick, walls thick enough to brag about, ziggurats climbing toward the sky. And then picture it now, just fragments under the desert sun. A reminder that even the greatest cities eventually become bedtime stories. So far, we've been gliding over Babylon's history like a slow balloon ride. But let's zoom in a little now, not on the bricks or the gates, but on the people who actually ran this place. The kings, the self-styled shepherds of the people, who were usually about as nurturing as a desert rock. Because behind the glowing image of Babylon, there were very real, very flawed men at the helm. And tonight, we're going to meet a few of them in all their dysfunctional glory. Let's start again with Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi gets remembered as this towering lawgiver, the guy who carved justice into stone, the Moses before Moses. But if you actually read through his laws, you'll notice that about half of them are just wildly specific property disputes. Like, If a man rents an ox and it dies from poor treatment, the renter must pay compensation. Or, if a tavern keeper gives watered-down beer, she shall be put to death. That last one, by the way, tells you everything you need to know about Babylonian priorities. Murder? Fine. Pay a fine. Bad beer? Straight to execution. Hammurabi's code also made sure elites got lighter punishments while peasants got slammed. Because of course it did. Equality wasn't exactly trending in 18th century BCE Mesopotamia, so while he gets sainted in textbooks, in reality, Hammurabi was just a savvy monarch making sure nobody questioned who was boss. And let's be honest, if your idea of immortality is chiselling tax policies into rock, you're not exactly the life of the party. Now let's float ahead to Nebuchadnezzar II, the celebrity king of Babylon. You'd think ruling the richest city in the world would make a person confident, but Nebuchadnezzar seems to have had a bit of a nervous streak. He spent his reign building, fortifying, and overcompensating. It's as if he thought, if I just stack enough bricks, people will stop rebelling. And to his credit, it mostly worked. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was jaw-droppingly impressive. But beneath all that grandeur, there's this sense that he was constantly worried about appearances. Take the Hanging Gardens, for example. If they really existed, they were allegedly built to soothe his homesick wife, Emitis of Media, which sounds sweet, but also sounds like a man desperately trying to keep the peace in the world's most high-maintenance marriage. Oh, you miss the mountains? Fine, I'll just build one out of stone in the middle of the desert. Romantic or slightly unhinged, you decide. Nebuchadnezzar also had a reputation for being a micromanager. He personally ordered renovations to temples, walls, canals, you name it. Imagine trying to be a Babylonian foreman while your king is hovering, pointing out where to lay the bricks straighter. Exhausting. And then, of course, there's the biblical side of his story. In the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar comes off as moody and a bit unstable. One day he's tossing people into fiery furnaces. Another day he's demanding dream interpretations. At one point he allegedly went mad, lived like an animal, and ate grass for 7 years, which, if true, makes him the original crash diet influencer. Historians don't exactly buy that last part, but the fact that people believed it says a lot. When your reputation is that guy who might actually eat grass, you know you left a mark. But if Nebuchadnezzar was intense, Nabonidus, the final king, was just odd. Nabonidus came to power in 556 BCE, and from day one he baffled his subjects. For starters, he wasn't even from the main royal line. His mum was apparently a high priestess, which gave him some clout, but he always felt a little out of place. Instead of focusing on Babylon's beloved god Marduk, Nabonidus had a weird obsession with the moon god, Sin. He even restored old temples to Sin in faraway Haran, while letting Marduk's grand temple in Babylon collect dust. You can imagine how well that went over. It's like if the Pope suddenly declared he was really into Norse mythology and started building shrines to Thor. And then came his great disappearing act. Nabonidus literally left Babylon for about 10 years to go live in an Arabian oasis called Tama. Just abandoned his capital. Historians still scratch their heads over this. Did he get bored? Was he sick? Was he just the kind of guy who ghosted an entire empire? Either way, the people of Babylon were not thrilled. Being ruled by a king on permanent vacation was bad enough, but being told to worship his pet moon god on top of that, unforgivable. So when Cyrus the Great showed up, the Babylonians practically begged him to take over. Nabonidus returned just in time to be defeated and carted off like yesterday's laundry. A pretty embarrassing ending. Now, let's drift back to Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's dad. He's less famous, but honestly, without him, Babylon wouldn't have had its second golden age. Nabopolassar was basically the scrappy rebel who toppled the Assyrians, which is like saying he punched the regional superpower in the face and got away with it. But he wasn't some noble freedom fighter. He just wanted power, and he got it by teaming up with the Medes, who were equally sick of Assyrian bullying. His reign was short compared to his son's, but it set the stage. Still, nobody remembers Nabopolassar. He's like the opening band at a concert. You only care if you're a die-hard fan. And finally, a little about those less documented Babylonian rulers. Because here's the thing. A lot of them were placeholders. Sons who couldn't live up to their dads. Brothers who stabbed each other in the back. Puppet kings propped up by foreign empires. Babylon was a magnet for dynastic dysfunction. There's a Mel-Marduk, Nebuchadnezzar's son, who reigned for only 2 years before being assassinated. He apparently tried to release prisoners to gain popularity, which sounds nice, until his court decided that was dangerously soft-hearted. Off he went. Then Neriglissar, a usurper who grabbed the throne by marrying into the royal family. His reign was a few years of May before he died, and left the throne to his young son. That kid didn't last long either. Basically, the decades after Nebuchadnezzar read like a messy family drama, where everyone took turns poisoning each other until Cyrus walked in and said, "All right, enough of this." So if you step back and look at Babylon's kings as people, what do you see? Hammurabi, the law chiseler, pretending to invent justice while actually protecting elites. Nebuchadnezzar, the anxious builder with a flair for grandeur and possibly goat-like dietary habits. Nabonidus, the absentee moon god groupie who ditched his empire like a bad summer camp. And a bunch of minor kings who barely managed to keep the palace furniture warm. It's a parade of ambition, ego, and dysfunction, all hidden behind the glitter of Babylon's walls. And maybe that's why Babylon's story sticks with us. Not because of the bricks or the gardens or the gates, but because it's painfully human. Every rise was driven by a king with big dreams. Every fall was thanks to someone's poor choices, fragile ego, or badly timed vacation. It's comforting in a way. 4,000 years later, and people in power are still doing the same things. Making laws that mostly help themselves. Building monuments nobody asked for. Ghosting responsibilities when things get tough. History doesn't just repeat, it yawns. So as we close this chapter of the story, picture the kings of Babylon not as statues or dusty names, but as flawed, tired men stumbling through history, trying, failing, and leaving us with ruins and bedtime stories. So far, we've been circling the big picture. Wars, kings, collapsing empires. But Babylon wasn't just walls and royal egos. It was a living, breathing city. And like any city, it ran on the small stuff. So let's dim the lights even further and wander into the back streets of Babylon. Past the towering ziggurat, past the blue-glazed Ishtar Gate, down to the narrow lanes where ordinary people were just trying to get through another dusty day. First things first, food. Babylonians, like most Mesopotamians, lived on a diet that would look, well, a little repetitive to us. The staples were bread, porridge, onions, and, most importantly, beer. Lots of beer. And not the crisp, golden kind you might picture. Babylonian beer was thick, cloudy, and probably tasted like someone left oatmeal soaking too long. But it was nutritious, filling, and safer than water most of the time. People drank it daily, from peasants to kings. There were even little clay tablets with beer ration lists, showing how much each worker got. Which means that, yes, archaeologists have basically recovered Babylon's equivalent of bar tabs. And if you're wondering, did they also drink wine? Yes, but it was mostly for the elite. For everyone else, beer was the comfort blanket. The ancient version of coffee, tea, and your late-night fridge raid rolled into one. Now, speaking of work, because someone had to pay for all those bricks Nebuchadnezzar was obsessed with. Most Babylonians were farmers. They grew barley, wheat, dates, and vegetables in the fertile soil along the canals. And let's pause there for a moment, because Babylon's agricultural system was basically one giant group project. Canals had to be dug, maintained, cleaned, and repaired constantly, which meant endless labour. And of course, if your section of the canal flooded or collapsed, you didn't just lose crops, you might also get dragged into court under Hammurabi's laws. Nothing says community bonding like being fined because your neighbours feel drowned. Urban workers were brickmakers, potters, metalsmiths, and, very importantly, scribes. Because Babylon loved its paperwork. Every contract, every trade, every marriage deal got pressed into a clay tablet. Archaeologists have dug up thousands of these things, and honestly, most of them are breathtakingly boring. Rents paid, donkeys sold, jars of sesame oil exchanged. Babylon was basically drowning in its own receipts, but let's not forget the religious side. The heart of Babylon's spiritual life was the great temple of Marduk, the city's patron god. Priests ran it like a corporation. They owned land, collected offerings, and kept entire staffs of cooks, musicians and administrators. If you imagine temples as serene places of prayer, think again. Babylonian temples were buzzing with activity, bureaucracy, and, of course, more paperwork. Ordinary people would bring offerings, bread, oil, sheep, even pigeons. Priests would sacrifice animals, burn incense, and mutter long hymns. And if you were sick, worried, or just unlucky, you could hire a temple exorcist to chase away your demons. Because naturally demons explained everything from headaches to crop failure. There were also fortune-tellers who read animal livers for omens, astronomers mapping the stars, and magicians selling protective charms. Babylon was basically the original mix of science, religion, and alternative medicine, all rolled into one slightly smoky temple complex. Now, let's peek into Babylonian households. If you lived in the city, your home was probably a mud brick rectangle, with a flat roof and a small courtyard. Not glamorous, but functional. The flat roofs were actually handy. They doubled as extra living space. Families would dry crops up there, sleep on them during hot nights, or just hang out under the stars. Inside, furniture was sparse. A few reed mats, maybe a wooden chest if you were lucky. Richer families might have low tables, oil lamps, and nicer pottery. Poorer families made do with whatever clay and reeds they could muster. Think minimalist living, but not by choice. And of course, the house wasn't just family space. It was also a workplace. Women baked bread, brewed beer, and wove cloth. Men often worked from home too, running small workshops for pottery or metal tools. The idea of work-life balance didn't exist. Life was work, and work was life. Marriage in Babylon was, well, let's just say it was less about romance and more about contracts. When two families agreed to marry off their children, they sealed the deal with a written contract. Yes, another clay tablet. It spelled out the dowry, the bride price, and what would happen if things went south. Wives had certain rights under Hammurabi's laws. They could own property, run businesses, and even divorce under some circumstances. But let's not get carried away. They were still under the thumb of male guardianship most of the time. Infidelity? Harshly punished for women, not so much for men. Classic history. Children, meanwhile, were considered valuable assets, especially sons who could inherit property and carry on the family name. Daughters usually ended up married off, their dowries carefully calculated like little economic packages. Nothing says family love like reducing your kids to line items. And then there were the markets. Babylon's streets were full of stalls selling bread, dates, spices, wool, and trinkets. Merchants from all over the region came to trade. Arameans, Persians, Phoenicians. The city was a crossroads, and the markets reflected that. But of course, where there's trade, there's also haggling. Babylonian contracts even include cases where someone tried to cheat on weights and measures. Hammurabi had laws about that too. If you shortchanged a buyer, you could be fined or worse. So next time you argue with a street vendor over price, remember, at least you don't risk being hauled before a king's judge for your onions. Let's not skip over entertainment either. Life in Babylon wasn't all farming, contracts and temple duties. People played board games. Yes, board games. Archaeologists have found game boards with little squares and dice-like objects. Some of them are basically the great-great-great-grandparents of modern backgammon. Music was huge too. Harps, lyres, drums and flutes filled the air during festivals and feasts. Dancing was part of the fun, though it usually came with religious overtones. Even the gods apparently liked a good party. And speaking of parties, the Babylonians loved festivals. New Year's celebrations, harvest feasts, temple rituals. There were always excuses to drink, eat, and light torches. Imagine dusty streets suddenly lit with fire, drums beating, and priests parading statues of gods through the city. A rare break from the grind of daily life. Of course, no city is without its problems. Babylon had crime, thieves, con men, and the occasional violent feud. That's why Hammurabi's code was so obsessed with punishments. There were also constant issues with debt. If you couldn't pay back your loans, you might end up selling yourself or your family into debt slavery, which is about as fun as it sounds. Disease was another shadow. With canals, crowded streets, and limited sanitation, sickness spread easily. No one had germ theory, of course. If you fell ill, it was either the gods punishing you or a demon taking up residence in your body, which meant the cure might be a mix of prayers, poultices, and a guy waving incense over your head. But despite all the struggles, Babylon was a vibrant place. Imagine standing in the city at dusk. The air smells like smoke, bread, and river mud. Priests chant in the distance, merchants pack up their stalls, families climb to their rooftops for the night breeze, beer is poured, lamps flicker. It wasn't a paradise. It wasn't even very glamorous for most people, but it was alive, and for centuries that life pulsed on day after day, even as kings rose and fell. And that's maybe the most comforting thing. Empires crumbled, dynasties collapsed, conquerors came and went, but ordinary Babylonians kept eating, drinking, working, and scribbling down receipts. The true backbone of history, people just trying to live. So, Babylon finally fell under Cyrus. Its bricks cooled, its gates stopped glittering, and yet the city didn't completely vanish. In fact, it grew into something far bigger than its physical walls. It became a symbol of pride, of sin, of empire and excess, a cautionary tale whispered for thousands of years. Let's float first into the biblical imagination. In the Hebrew Bible, Babylon is painted as the ultimate villain, the city that exiled the Jewish people, the city that defied God, and it stuck. Babylon became shorthand for oppression, decadence, and punishment. The Book of Daniel even features Nebuchadnezzar himself. Remember him, the anxious builder, as a slightly unhinged tyrant, tossing people into fiery furnaces, going mad for 7 years, eating grass. Moral of the story: don't get too proud, or the gods, or God, will have a word with you. And so the real city faded, but the idea of Babylon grew. It became larger than life. The shiny gates and ziggurats were no longer just architectural wonders. They were metaphors for hubris, ambition, and human folly. Greek and Roman writers joined in. Herodotus, the famous ancient tourist blogger, visited Mesopotamia centuries after Babylon's peak. He marvelled at the ruins. The walls, he said, were enormous. The canals were impressive. And yet, he also told stories of decadence. Babylonians were painted as indulgent, obsessed with luxury, dancing and feasting while the empire trembled under weak rulers. It's hard to know how accurate that was. Maybe Herodotus exaggerated because exaggeration sells stories, or maybe Babylonians really did throw a few too many parties. Either way, the narrative of Babylon, the city that had everything and wasted it, was cemented. Fast forward to Christianity. Babylon gets a makeover. Suddenly it's not just a city, it's a concept. The whore of Babylon, the harlot of Revelation, a place of temptation, corruption, and moral decay. Entire sermons and moral treatises used Babylon as a cautionary tale. So imagine being a Babylonian brickmaker in the 6th century BCE, long gone, and suddenly people 1,500 years later are preaching your city as a symbol of evil. That's the afterlife of reputation. A harsh one, but memorable. Medieval Europe took it further. Travellers and mapmakers filled in Babylon with exotic details they had never seen. Glittering palaces, dangerous harlots, rivers flowing with wine. By this point, the real Babylon, a crumbling mud brick ruin, was almost irrelevant. Its myth had surpassed it. Renaissance writers and artists continued the trend. The city became an allegory for the dangers of pride, the inevitability of decay, and the seductive power of luxury. You could visit Babylon in your imagination without ever having to deal with Mesopotamian dust or canal maintenance. And the fascination never really ended. Even into the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists dug up Babylon and found mud, mostly, broken walls, some inscriptions, a lot of debris. Yet the myth persisted. In textbooks, novels, films, and even reggae songs, Babylon represented power, corruption, and longing. It's poetic, really. A city that could not survive physically became immortal in ideas. Its story, the rise, the fall, the kings, the ordinary people, lives on in our collective imagination. And what about the people who actually lived there? We've already met the kings. We've wandered the markets, slept on mud brick rooftops, sipped thick beer, and haggled over barley. Those daily lives, once unremarkable, now echo faintly through archaeology. Clay tablets record mundane transactions, family disputes, and contracts. In a way, Babylon's ordinary citizens are the quiet heroes. While kings built walls, wrote laws, and went mad, the bakers, brewers, scribes, and farmers kept the city alive. They lived, ate, argued, and laughed. Their footprints are faint, but they exist. And perhaps that's more enduring than any king's hubris. Let's pause to picture the city centuries later in ruins, the Ishtar Gate dismantled, the ziggurats fallen into jagged piles of brick, dust everywhere, a few families squatting among the ruins, canals silting over. Yet, in imagination, Babylon is still bright, gleaming, alive with kings, priests, markets, and beer. It's like closing your eyes in a quiet room. You can picture a city that no longer exists but still feels real. And that, perhaps, is why Babylon never really died. Not entirely. So, as we drift toward the end of this long, sleepy journey, think of Babylon as both a city and a story. A city of ambition, architectural wonders, and dynastic chaos. A story of kings with too much ego and not enough sense. A place of ordinary people, quietly living their lives, leaving clay tablets as evidence that life went on. A myth, growing larger with every telling, becoming a symbol of pride, sin, and the fleeting nature of power. And perhaps the final lesson is gentle and sleepy. Greatness is fragile. Cities crumble, empires fade, kings make terrible choices, but the echoes, stories, myths, records, and memories can last for millennia. Babylon whispers to us now through ruins, clay tablets, and myths. It whispers that even when everything falls apart, life keeps happening. People keep eating, drinking, building, and dreaming. And occasionally a city can become something bigger than itself, immortal, if only in story. So pull the blankets up, close your eyes. Imagine the thick walls of Babylon, the flickering lamps, the smell of bread and river mud, the distant chanting of priests. Hear the soft footsteps of kings pacing, the murmur of families on rooftops, the gentle splash of canals. And let the city, its people, and its stories lull you into sleep. Because Babylon, in all its flawed, muddy, glorious human complexity, is a perfect companion for the night. So if you've been following along, we've wandered through Babylon's rise, its fall, the eccentric kings, and the sleepy streets of its people. But there's still more to settle into as night falls. Babylon had quirks, habits, and little stories that never made the textbooks, or maybe did, but in tiny footnotes no one read. Let's float back to the kings for a bit. Hammurabi, for example, wasn't just a law chiseler. He had little oddities too. Apparently he liked to be involved in minor disputes personally. There's a story, or at least a clay tablet, that records Hammurabi stepping in to settle an argument over a missing goat. Not exactly epic. But you can imagine the king sitting in his throne room, scribes shuffling nervously, while Hammurabi goes, "This goat? Let's see. Yes, I side with the farmer." He also seemed to enjoy a little dramatic flair in his legal decrees. Some punishments were oddly theatrical, like, if someone steals an ox, not only must they repay it, but also pay half again in silver, which is both practical and slightly cruelly theatrical. Hammurabi clearly had a flair for combining bureaucracy with intimidation. Nebuchadnezzar II, we already know, was obsessed with building. But he also had moods, chronic anxieties, some sources say, bordering on paranoia. Some days he might inspect walls personally. Other days he'd retreat to his palaces to obsess over minor ceremonial details like how incense was burned or whether priests were bowing at exactly the right angle. He also had a thing for luxury and appearances. His walls were blue, his gates decorated with lions and dragons. And yet, every brick was also a way of signalling power. He wanted everyone to see Babylon and immediately think, "I am tiny. This is huge. Do not question it." Classic micromanaging emperor energy. And Nabonidus, the final king, deserves a few more quiet chuckles. He wasn't just obsessed with the moon god Sin. He also conducted some questionable archaeological projects. He liked digging up old temples, restoring them, sometimes for reasons historians still can't figure out. Imagine him wandering around in sandals, brushing dust off a ziggurat, muttering prayers to the moon, while the city slowly grew impatient. And let's not forget his extended vacation. 10 years away from Babylon, leaving priests and citizens to handle everything. Maybe he was meditating. Maybe he just really disliked paperwork. Either way, Nabonidus turned absentee monarchy into an art form. Let's pause on the minor kings. They may not have left as many stories, but they were fascinating in their own subdued way. Take Amel-Marduk, Nebuchadnezzar's short-lived son. He tried to be a people's king, releasing prisoners to curry favour. The palace insiders apparently hated this, and within 2 years, he was assassinated. Lesson learned: don't try to be nice when your court prefers fear. Then Neriglissar, another short-lived ruler, married into the royal family to legitimize his claim. His reign lasted a few years before he died naturally. His son, the heir, couldn't hold on to the throne either. The empire was effectively a reality show, but one where everyone had swords and clay tablets instead of cameras. Now, back to ordinary Babylonians. There's something deeply relaxing about imagining them going about life in ways we can still recognize. Bakers woke early to knead barley dough. The smell of baking bread mingled with the river's mud. Brewers, mostly women, prepared beer, probably grumbling that barley prices were too high and that someone always stole the yeast. Farmers tended crops, worried constantly about canal maintenance. Scribes sat hunched over clay tablets, recording rents, debts, and arguments. A little domestic bureaucracy, Babylonian style. And the sensory world of the city was rich. Imagine walking through the market at dawn. The smell of wet mud from last night's river overflow, bread baking in ovens, the tang of fermented beer, the sound of donkeys braying, children laughing, and priests chanting in distant temples. The streets were narrow, shaded by mud brick walls. The sun hit the top of the ziggurats, casting long, comforting shadows. At night, lamps flickered, music played softly, and the city had its own quiet rhythm. Families climbed onto rooftops to sleep or simply breathe, while the canals reflected the stars. Life carried on quietly, day after day, generation after generation. Marriage was still a practical affair, and family life had its own oddities. Hammurabi's laws show that property disputes within families were common. Wives could sometimes inherit property, daughters were carefully married off with dowries calculated to the nearest grain, and sons carried on family trades. There were disputes over food, land, livestock, and occasionally over how to divide beer rations. Babylonians were intensely practical. Love might exist, but contracts ruled the day. A marriage contract could cover dozens of contingencies. Divorce? Permitted, if you were careful. Adultery? Punishable. But the punishments were often wildly uneven. Classic human hypocrisy. Babylonian festivals were in some ways the city's heartbeat. The New Year festival, Akitu, was a 10-day extravaganza blending religion, politics and theatre. Priests would lead processions, carry statues of gods, and perform ritual dramas. Kings participated, or were humbly reminded of their place, depending on the year. Citizens ate, drank, played music, and took a break from daily life. These festivals reminded everyone that for a short while Babylon could feel magical. Now, a quiet note about education. Babylonian children, mostly boys, could learn to read and write in cuneiform. This was hard work, pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets until your fingers cramped. The reward? Becoming a scribe, which was basically middle management in the ancient world. Girls rarely learned writing formally, but they often mastered domestic management and artisan skills. Education, like everything else, was a combination of survival and status. Writing well could get you a better job, better pay, and maybe a slightly more comfortable life. Or at least fewer complaints from the king. And then there was the law. Hammurabi's code still governed much of everyday life. Theft, assault, family disputes, commercial disagreements, all recorded, all punishable. And yet, people found ways to navigate it. Minor bribery, clever wording in contracts, and negotiated settlements kept things moving. Life was a quiet balance between order and chaos, with clay tablets as the official record. Finally, let's linger one last time on the sensory and emotional world of Babylon. The sun warmed mud brick walls in the morning. The air smelled of river water, baked bread, and incense from temples. Children ran through alleys, chased goats, or played board games with simple dice. People drank beer, argued over debts, mended their homes, and whispered prayers. The city pulsed with life, quietly, endlessly, oblivious to the fact that kings would rise and fall, empires would crumble, and historians would write thousands of words about it millennia later. And yet, in the quiet repetition of daily life, Babylon endured, not in glory, not in gold, but in the rhythm of people living, surviving, and dreaming. So, as night deepens, imagine Babylon again. Not the monumental city of kings and legends, not the mythic city of sin and pride, but the city as it truly was. Mud brick walls, canals glistening in the sun, markets bustling with bread and beer, families climbing rooftops to sleep, and the hum of life quietly persisting. Because in the end, Babylon's story isn't just about empires, kings, or myths. It's about people, and the gentle, persistent, utterly human heartbeat of a city that refused to disappear entirely from memory. By now, we've wandered through Babylon's rise, fall, kings, citizens, and myths. We've smelled the mud, tasted the thick beer, and heard the distant chants of priests. But before we settle fully into sleep, let's linger a bit more, slow our pace, and wander through a few final details that bring the city to life in quiet, almost invisible ways. First, a few more tales of royal quirks. We've mentioned Nebuchadnezzar's anxieties, but here's something subtle. He had a peculiar interest in dreams. Not just any dreams, but prophetic ones. Ancient records hint that he would consult his court about interpreting even the smallest nightly visions. The court scribes had to memorize a staggering number of dream interpretations just to keep him from pacing the palace corridors at 2 a.m. Imagine the king muttering about lions, trees, or strange clay figures in his sleep, and everyone quietly nodding, afraid to contradict him. And then there's the story of his son, Amel-Marduk, whose short reign was marked by an unusual indulgence in freeing prisoners. A kind, almost naive ruler in the middle of a palace full of scheming officials. It's quietly tragic, trying to be humane in a world built on hierarchy and fear. 2 years later, he was gone. History barely paused for him. But in imagining him, there's a softness, a reminder that history isn't only epic battles and big names. It's also small gestures, sometimes doomed to fail. Now, Nabonidus deserves one more quiet chuckle. His fascination with the moon god Sin wasn't merely a religious quirk. He apparently kept a personal observatory to study the stars and the moon. So while kings before him were focused on walls, canals and temples, he might have spent nights cataloguing the heavens, counting moons and pondering celestial cycles. In a way, it's almost poetic. A king detached from his city, absorbed in the mysteries above, leaving Babylonians to manage mud, water, and daily life. It's tempting to imagine him sitting alone under the stars, writing notes in cuneiform, completely unaware that his obsession would earn him centuries of confusion and whispers from historians. But let's turn from kings to ordinary people. In Babylon, life was subtle, full of little victories and daily rituals. Bakers would greet neighbours, grumble about barley shortages, and occasionally sneak a little extra dough for themselves. Brewers might experiment with new grains, hoping for a tastier beer without the priest noticing. Children ran through alleyways, sometimes climbing walls to spy on festivals or watch processions of priests and statues. Women ran households with quiet efficiency, preparing meals, brewing beer, weaving textiles, and occasionally negotiating small family disputes. There's an understated magic in their daily work, a rhythm that held the city together. Markets deserve one last stroll. The air was fragrant with spices, cumin, coriander, sesame oil. Clay pots lined the streets, holding grains, dates, and preserved fish. Merchants called out prices in measured tones. Buyers haggled patiently, or impatiently, over ounces of barley or sacks of grain. Sometimes, a minor theft or dispute would break out, only to be settled by scribes recording every detail for future reference. Babylon's markets were a combination of commerce, performance, and quiet chaos. Imagine standing in a shaded corner, listening to the overlapping sounds of barter, laughter, and the occasional bray of a donkey. The city's pulse is soft, persistent, and oddly comforting, like the slow rhythm of breath at bedtime. And festivals, let's drift back to those for a moment. The Akitu, or New Year festival, was more than pomp. It was a citywide meditation on order and chaos, mortality and divine favour. Priest-led processions carried statues and enacted rituals that reminded everyone of their place in the cosmos. Kings participated, sometimes reluctantly, often anxiously. Citizens ate, drank, danced, and observed quietly. Even in its extravagance, the festival had a gentle undertone. Life persists. The world spins. Time moves forward, regardless of empires or tyrants. Imagine walking through the festival at dusk. Torches flicker. Shadows of towering walls stretch across the streets. Music hums softly. Children run past, their laughter mingling with the chants of priests. A baker offers sweetened barley cakes. A brewer pours thick, foamy beer. The city breathes. Education in Babylon was another quiet anchor. Boys mostly learned cuneiform from a young age. Tablets scratched with stylus marks. Fingers cramping from practice. They memorized lists of gods, laws, and economic transactions. Some would become scribes, middle managers of empire bureaucracy, ensuring that taxes were collected, contracts recorded, and disputes settled. Girls learned domestic skills, weaving, baking, and managing homes. Knowledge, like life, was quietly practical, gently shaping the rhythm of Babylonian society. Even minor annoyances hold a strange charm. Dogs roaming streets, minor floods along canals, arguments over property boundaries, or a neighbour's goat chewing someone else's barley stalks. Clay tablets show complaints, fines, and resolutions. These small stories, often overlooked, are the heartbeat of the city, the subtle, human pulse beneath walls of stone and legend. There's a hypnotic rhythm in imagining it. Small, repeated actions, people going about their lives with quiet persistence. Nothing dramatic, nothing shocking, just life, moving softly through alleys, homes and markets. And then, of course, there's the gradual fading of Babylon. Seleucus I built Seleucia on the Tigris. The city's centre shifted. Kings, for the most part, left Babylon behind. Parthians and later empires let it decline further. Mud brick walls eroded, ziggurats crumbled, canals silted. The city became quieter, slower, emptier. Yet, even in decline, the city remained inhabited. A handful of families lived among the ruins, cultivating small plots, keeping minor trades alive. Occasionally a travelling merchant or a scribe might pause there, noting that the city was less grand than before, yet still a city of life. It's easy to imagine twilight in these later centuries, sun sinking behind broken walls. A family gathers in a courtyard. The air smells of baked barley and river mud. A dog whines in the alley. Children whisper while playing board games on clay tiles. The city is quieter, yes, but still breathing. And finally, the legacy. Babylon lives in myth, literature, music, and imagination. The biblical tales, Greek and Roman accounts, medieval European imaginings, and modern archaeology all paint it in different lights. Prideful city, sinful city, magical city, forgotten city. And yet, in all of these versions, a core truth persists. Babylon was a place of humans, flawed, working, loving, dreaming, and occasionally failing spectacularly. Its kings were eccentric, ambitious, paranoid, or absentee. Its citizens were practical, resilient, and quietly persistent. The walls, ziggurats, canals, and gates were beautiful, but life was lived in the narrow alleys, kitchens, markets, and courtyards. So as you finally settle into your pillow, imagine Babylon one last time. Hear the soft footfalls in alleys. Smell bread baking, beer fermenting, incense drifting from temples. Feel the warmth of sun-heated mud brick walls. Watch children scamper across rooftops. Hear distant chants and soft music. Taste the thick barley beer, sweetened slightly, shared among friends or family. Picture the kings pacing nervously, the priests muttering, the scribes scratching their clay tablets. Watch as life continues quietly, softly, persistently, through centuries, empires, and the rise and fall of stone. And then, let it fade. The walls crumble, the ziggurats fall, the gates are dismantled, but the stories, the whispers, the memory of Babylon, endlessly human, endlessly alive, remain. And in that gentle echo, let yourself drift fully into sleep.